stories with you, like the one I'm about to, concerning Native Americans and how aggressive they were with the interlopers on their land. It's not done to make the Native American person or culture look bad. Would not do that. I admire the culture that they had before it was decimated, if you will. But there are a lot of stories of, the early contact era and that show that they fought for what they believed was theirs, and it truly was theirs. So I'm going to share a story with you called "The Fiendish Character of Indians Illustrated." And again, I ask that you just keep in mind what these people were being put through at the hands of people that they welcomed as friends in the beginning. So here we go. About the time of the American Revolution, and shortly after, the northeast western portion of Virginia was frequently overrun by parties of Shawnee Indians who committed all sorts of atrocities upon the dwellers in that region. Among those residents was a Mr. Moore with his family. Now, on the 14th of July, 1786, early in the morning, a gang of horses had come from the lick blocks about 100 yards from the house, and Mr. Moore had gone out there to salt them. Two men also were living with him, and they had gone out and were reaping wheat, when 30 Indians who were lying in ambush watching the house at the time, supposing that all the men were absent, availed themselves of the opportunity and rushed forward with all their speed. As they advanced, they commenced firing and killed 3 of the children, William and Rebecca, who were returning from the spring, and Alexander, who was killed in the yard. Mr. Moore attempted to get to his house, but finding it surrounded, ran past it through a small pasture in which the house stood. And when he reached the fence, he made a halt and was shot through with 7 bullets. The Indians said he might have escaped if he had not stopped on the fence. After he was shot, he ran about 40 yards and fell, and he was then scalped by the Indians and afterwards buried by the whites at the place where the body lay and where his grave may yet be seen. I don't know where that is because it was not recorded in the material that I have here. But it was thought that when he saw his family about to be massacred, without the possibility of rendering them any assistance, he chose to share their like fate. There were 2 fierce dogs which fought like heroes until one was killed. The 2 men who were reaping, hearing the alarm and seeing the house surrounded, fled and alarmed the settlement. At that time, the nearest family was 6 miles distant. As soon as the alarm was given, Mrs. Moore and Miss Martha Ivins, who was living in the family, helping them to spin, barred the door, but that was to no avail at all. There was no man in the house except John Simpson, an old Englishman, and he was up in the loft, sick and in bed. Now there were 5 or 6 guns in the house, but having been shot off the evening before, they were at that point empty. It was intended to have loaded them after breakfast. Now Martha Ivins took 2 of them and went upstairs where Simpson was and handed them to him and told him to shoot. And he looked up, but he had been shot in the head through a crack, and he was then near his end. Martha then went to a far end of the house, lifted up a loose plank and went under the floor. And Polly Moore, a child of about 8 years, hid behind some barrels in the loft. And in the meantime, the Indians cut down the door and they entered the house. Mrs. Moore and her children, John, Jane, and Peggy, were soon secured. An Indian went up into the loft where he found Polly, almost frightened to death, huddled behind the barrels. The Indians then left the house with their prisoners, and Martha, thinking they had gone away entirely, came out from her hiding place, ran out and got behind a log not far from the house. The Indians were still about, trying to catch the horses and preparing to set the dwellings and the house, the outdwellings and the house on fire. Martha, believing that one of them saw her behind the log, got up and ran towards a small building near the dwelling, used as a tool house, and as she reached the door, an Indian threw his tomahawk at her, and the weapon buried itself in the door near Martha's head, but she was uninjured. She then reflected that escape was impossible and gave herself up, at which the Indians seemed very much pleased. The houses were then set on fire. The whole party then set out for the Indian towns. Perceiving that John Moore was a boy weak in body and mind and unable to travel, they killed him on the first day. The babe, Margaret, they took 2 or 3 days, but it being fretful on account of the wound it had received, they killed that baby. They soon moved on with haste to their towns. For some time it was usual to tie very securely each of the prisoners at night, and for a warrior to lie beside each of them with a tomahawk in hand, so that in the case of pursuit, the prisoners might be speedily dispatched. Not unfrequently, there were several days without food, and when they killed game, their habit was to make broth. When they reached their town, they assembled in council, and an old Indian made a long speech to them, dissuading them from war. But at the close of it, the warriors shook their heads and retired. The old Indian afterwards took Polly Moore under his care and showed her all possible kindness. And shortly after they arrived at the towns, Mrs. Moore and her daughter Jane were put to death, being burned at the stake. This lasted some time, during which they manifested the most Christian fortitude and bore it without a murmur. Mrs. Moore at intervals conversing with her daughter Polly and Martha Ivins, and expressing great anxiety for the moment to arrive when her soul should wing its way to the bosom of her Savior. At length, an old squaw, more human than the rest, dispatched her with a tomahawk. This tribe of Indians proving very troublesome to the whites, it was repeatedly contemplated to send an expedition to their own, and then it is probable Martha Ivins in some measure postponed by sending communications through the traders urging the probable fate of the prisoners being held by the Indians, if it was done immediately. And now in November, 2 years afterwards, however, such an expedition did go out indeed. And the Indians were aware of it from about the time it started, and when it drew near, they concealed what they could not carry off, and with prisoners, they left their towns. About this time, Molly Moore had serious thoughts of concealing herself until the arrival of the whites, but fearing the consequences of a greater delay in their arrival than she might anticipate, she decided not to attempt it. Late in November, however, the expedition did arrive, and after having burned their towns, destroyed their corn, etc., they returned home. And after this, the Indians returned to their towns, but winter having set in, and finding themselves without houses or food, they were greatly dispirited and went to Detroit, where, giving themselves up to great excess in drinking, they sold Polly Moore to a man living in or near a village named Frenchtown, near the western end of Lake Erie. They sold her for half a gallon of rum. Though at this time the winter was very severe, the released captives had nothing to protect their bare feet but a pair of deerskin moccasins, so they were suffering. And Martha Ivins and Polly and Peggy Moore were ransomed some months after this time, and they displayed much fortitude amid the dreadful suffering they were compelled to undergo. Yet it was very long before they could shake off the remembrances of the horrible fate of the other members of their family. And that is the story. Again, it would seem to paint the Native American as savage, vicious, fierce, and they were. But you have to consider what was being done to them too, and what was being taken from them. So I hope that you found the story interesting. It's one of hundreds out there that tell about what frontier life was like. Some of it was good, some of it was like this bad. But I hope that you found this interesting, and I hope to be with you again real soon. I love you all very much on the other side of that monitor, and God bless you, and stay safe, healthy, and well always. Soon.